안녕하세요. 오늘 날씨가 좋네요. 이렇게 햇빛이 이렇게 아주 그냥 날씨가 좋습니다. 오늘은 저녁에 회식이 있습니다. 그래서 오늘 아침에 일어나서 미리 운동을 하는 거예요. 이번 주는 오후 출근입니다. 그래서 아침에 영어학원 가고 수영 가고 그럽니다. 피곤해. 졸려요. 너무 졸려. 날씨 너무 좋다. 햇살. 오늘은 해가 떴네요. 네, 해가 떴습니다. 이렇게. 아, 일단 일어나자마자니까 스트레칭 위주로 하겠습니다. 이따가 수영을 해야 돼서 11시에 강습이 있습니다. 수영. 어제 2주 만에 수영 갔더니 죽을 것 같아요. 죽을 것 체력이 너무 달려. 일단 어저께 턱걸이 한 거 몸 좀 풀고 공이 어디 있지? CNN을 들겠습니다.
No choice but to do that.
Let's talk about the Republicans you mentioned there. We heard from one Republican from Ohio who said this, Stephen. Take a listen.
All of that is alarming. As I've said from the beginning, I think this is not okay. The President of the United States shouldn't, even in the original phone call, be on the phone with the president of another country and raise his political opponent. So, no, this is not okay.
So it's not okay, but he's the first Republican I've heard thus far saying this is not okay. So could we potentially start seeing Republicans pulling away or dumping Trump? Or was that too soon?
I don't think that was a case of dumping Trump. I think Mike Turner was there creating some space for him to adopt that argument that I was talking about, that eventually it's going to have to be the Republican position in a Senate trial, that the president did wrong, but it didn't rise to the level of an impeachable offense. Turner also said in that interview that there was no quid pro quo offered to the Ukrainians, and that the president was largely acting within his powers, even if it wasn't appropriate for him to act in that way. So you're going to see Republicans trying to make some space for themselves if this week shows that the Democratic case is as strong as it looks to be.
Thanks very much, Stephen Collinson there.
Oh.
Now, Alexander, I wanted to go back to, if I could, actually, to our top story, and that is we're going to take you to Hong Kong, the standoff between protesters and police at Hong Kong's Polytechnic University. I want to bring in Anthony Daparan out of her Hong Kong bureau. He's a lawyer and the author of City of Protest, A Recent History of Dissent in Hong Kong. Thank you very much, Anthony, for being with us this hour. I saw a live report from our correspondent, being heard as well from the student union, basically saying there's still students inside. You've been following this quite closely, I saw from your Twitter page, your Twitter feed. What is your sense of what is unfolding there?
Yeah, it's been really quite remarkable. I was in the campus all day on Sunday before the police cordon finally tightened there. And it's really been this ongoing standoff between the students who want to defend the sanctity of their campus and the police who think that there are rioters hiding in there and want to flush them out. The really concerning thing is that there doesn't seem to be any approaches toward compromise on either side. The police have said they intend to arrest everyone on the side and charge them with rioting, which has a 10-year jail sentence attached to it. And some of the students inside have said they're willing to die for the cause that they're standing there for. That creates an extremely concerning dynamic, and I don't know how we're going to reach a point where there can be some kind of sensible compromise here.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Then what is the solution? Because both sides clearly digging in.
So one of the solutions that thousands of people in Hong Kong last night attempted was to try and actually approach the campus from the outside and rescue the students. So what we saw on the streets here last night with thousands of people descending from all directions in Kowloon. They were tearing up the paving stones to try and disrupt the police vehicles and police chargers, tried to get into the campus, but they weren't successful. A few senior government officials, or not government officials rather, but politicians have approached the site, and one or two have gone in to attempt some kind of negotiations, but there hasn't been any breakthrough so far.
Would you say, is it fair to say we are at breaking point here?
We are certainly at the most extreme point we've reached so far in these many months of protests. The last week of fairly chaotic scenes was already a high point, and these last 2 days are really potentially something of a breaking point, especially with elections scheduled for this coming weekend. It's looking very unlikely that they're going to be able to go ahead in these circumstances. And then what kind of reaction we're going to see from the Hong Kong people if those elections are postponed or even cancelled, maybe yet another flashpoint. So it really is a very volatile situation at the moment here.
You're in the region, you get a sense of what is happening, you see it with your own eyes. Give me a sense of what you're hearing, if you're hearing anything in terms of reaction from the Hong Kong government, whether they're saying enough, doing enough, and also reaction from Beijing. What is your sense?
와, 무슨 홍콩이 나오고 있는데 무슨 전쟁한 거 같네 진짜. 와, 대박이네.
Unfolding the last 2 days. Any other normal city, you'd expect to see the city's political leadership out there explaining, reassuring, justifying what was going on to the population. Carrie Lam has not made any public statements except a brief statement on her Facebook page and a televised appearance visiting one of the injured policemen. She hasn't spoken to the population at all. Other government ministers are completely invisible. And in the meantime, we've had fairly strong rhetoric coming out of Beijing in the course of last week, including from Chinese President Xi Jinping himself about the need to bring Hong Kong to heel. So there really isn't any sign of compromise coming from the Hong Kong government. And that's another thing I think is very concerning for the Hong Kong people. There's a complete lack of leadership and they're being left in a vacuum really here.
And as you were talking, we're looking at pictures from Sunday, from Monday as well. These ones are from Sunday. And anyone looking at this, you know, you wouldn't recognize Hong Kong. It looks like almost like a beginning of a war zone. What has been the impact of Hong Kong? I mean, as a financial center, financial hub in the heart of tourism, what has been the effect on Hong Kong?
Up until now, over the many months of protest, day-to-day life has been going on as normal in Hong Kong. And when you have a large violent protests such as even a few blocks away, ordinary life has been going on as normal. This last week, I think that changed, in particular with significant disruptions to traffic and transportation networks that the protesters had managed to affect, with classes being cancelled at schools, with lunchtime protests in the central business district every single lunchtime for the past 6 consecutive working days. We're reaching the point now where daily life is being affected. Certainly tourists are going to be put off by these images and not going to be coming to Hong Kong. And if this continues, we really are now reaching the point where day-to-day life is being significantly disrupted. And the interesting thing is that disruption itself doesn't seem to be hugely undermining support from the protesters. Certainly some people have some misgivings, but people who've been supporting the protesters from the beginning seem to be continuing to express the view, while we don't necessarily agree with the violence or the disruptions, we still support the underlying cause. And that seems to be some very entrenched positions that we have here.
Very important context there. Anthony Brown, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you.
Now, in Washington, a major reversal by the Trump administration of America's long-standing policy on Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Just hours ago, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the change as the U.S. now rejects a decades-old State Department legal opinion that deems settlements inconsistent with international law. The move is expected to further strain tensions with Palestinians, but provide a boost to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is struggling for political survival.
Calling the establishment of civilian settlements inconsistent with international law hasn't worked. It hasn't advanced the cause of peace. The hard truth is, there will never be a judicial resolution to the conflict, and arguments about who is right and wrong as a matter of international law will not bring peace. This is a complex political problem that can only be solved by negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Oren Lieberman has been following the developments from Jerusalem and has this view.
Kisa, the Trump administration's announcement that it no longer considers Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank as inconsistent with international law is a change in decades of U.S. foreign policy, but it shouldn't come as that much of a surprise. The U.S. under President Donald Trump already stopped considering the West Bank occupied territory, and the former official on the peace team, Jason Greenblatt, said settlements should just be called cities and towns. This appears to be an extension of that policy. It's a blatant win for Israel's right wing and advocates of the settlements, and they began celebrating immediately, with some even Israeli sovereignty of the West Bank, which is annexation. Palestinian leaders slammed the move and said nothing would change the fact that settlements are still considered illegal under international law, whether the U.S. wants to recognize it or not. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said this doesn't prejudge the status of settlements and negotiations, but this is nothing other than a green light for the continued expansion of settlements. Pompeo said the administration has been working on this for a year.
진짜 필라테스가 전 시급합니다. 요가.
Timing of this announcement. It seems a direct rejection of last week's European Court of Justice ruling that products and goods produced in Israeli settlements in the West Bank have to be labeled as such. They can't just say made in Israel. Second, whether the timing was intentional or not, this is a major gift to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who called it recognizing a historical truth. That as he finds himself in a perilous political situation. It's a boost to the longtime Israeli leader and to Israel's right wing as a whole, as Netanyahu tries to hang on to the position. In the end, who stands to benefit the most? That would likely be President Donald Trump. This is a decision that will go over incredibly well with the religious evangelical base that sees Israel as a key issue. Lisa?
Thank you very much, Aurelien, there. Now, Iranians already under sanctions react to new price hikes, and now their government is threatening to crack down decisively on their protests. Plus, critics call for Prince Andrew to be forthcoming about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, as another woman, so she too was a victim. We bring you both those stories after a very short break. You are watching Your World Today.
He could tell you to go to hell in such a way that you look forward to the trip.
He's unafraid.
He has guts.
He's a risk taker.
He is doing more wild stuff than almost anyone.
와 큰일이다 진짜.
Business mogul.
Ted has the knack of being able to see around corners.
Not just one corner, many corners. But every move was part of a bigger plan.
Save everything.
He wanted to save the world.
Absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy.
The environment is in his soul.
Conserving millions of acres, saving endangered species.
We're fast approaching the tipping point.
Save everything. Yeah, why not? It's worth saving. Ted Turner, Captain Planet. Sunday on CNN.
This is the 100 Club, our look at companies that are 100 years old or older. For a century, AIA Group has served millions of people and generations of families across Asia Pacific. The life insurance company was established in Shanghai in 1919 by American businessman Cornelius van der Star. His enterprise was based on the idea that people in Asia would find insurance attractive because of their desire to care for their families. In the 1930s and 40s, the Hong Kong-based company began its expansion across Southeast Asia. Over the last 100 years, it has gone on to become one of the largest life insurers in Asia. In 2010, AIA listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. At the time, it was the third largest IPO globally. The company now has a presence in 18 markets across the region.
Now, as we track the confrontations we've been seeing in Hong Kong, we are following another scene of unrest between protesters as well as security forces, this one in Iran. Demonstrations began on Friday after the government announced petrol price increases of at least 50%. Security services have fired on crowds in several cities, and according to the government, several protesters have died. Now, state television has reported that the Revolutionary Guards have warned of decisive action if the unrest does not end. Iran's president also is calling for calm with a less confrontational tone.
Protest is different from riots. The entire nation has the right to protest. They can protest, they can even criticize the government, even harshly, and we welcome that. There is no problem about whatever they say, but we should not let any insecurity in the society. I own a car to use it, not to block the roads.
CNN's Phil Black has been following the unrest in Iran and has more dramatic video.
The few videos now emerging from Iran show brief, chaotic moments. Security forces firing weapons. Banks and other buildings severely damaged by fire. Crowds of people, some running in fear. Others together, determined and chanting against the Iranian government. In this video, people linger in the eerie and smoky aftermath of violence in the city of Shiraz. The world's view of events in Iran has been narrowed by an almost total internet blackout. But these images, which have surfaced on social media, appear to show a sudden, dramatic outpouring of anger across the country by people fed up with tough economic conditions and what they see as corrupt leadership. American sanctions designed to change Iran's behavior in the region are already biting hard. Now the government wants to increase the price of petrol by at least half, with steeper hikes for those who exceed strict rationing. The Iranian government says the price increase is necessary to help Iran's poorest families, and it blames the United States for encouraging riots and sabotage. CNN, London.
The storm is not blowing over after Prince Andrew's attempt to explain his long-time friendship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Reports say the Queen and other senior royals back and believe what he told the BBC. But the media, as well as the public, simply are not satisfied.
You were staying at the house of a convicted sex offender.
It was a convenient place to stay. I've gone through this in my mind so many times. At the end of the day, with the benefit of all the hindsight that one can have, it was definitely the wrong thing to do. But at the time, I felt it was the honourable and right thing to do.
이러면서 지금 스트레칭 하고 있는 거예요.
Admit fully that my judgment was probably coloured by my tendency to be too honourable.
심각해.
Just the way it is.
I thought it was embarrassing. I thought that he expressed no remorse for the victims. I thought his answers were comically unbelievable. He somehow remembers that he's at a need to express. He doesn't sweat. I thought that it was a bad idea.
I can't believe he didn't even apologise or did anything remotely to just say sorry, or it was just all about him. So that's all I can say about that.
Doesn't look good on the establishment, really, does it? You know, I mean, they try to uphold this sense of, legality, and I think he's sort of let them down in a way.
Meanwhile, another woman who accused Epstein of abuse when she was a child also read a statement to reporters on Monday, calling on Prince Andrew to come forward to have his day in court. How is the impeachment inquiry swaying swing voters? CNN visits the key state of Wisconsin to gauge public opinion. Some voters' opinions may surprise you. And two new polls from other states show how divided Democratic field is in the race for the White House. We'll explain all after this.
Transforming business, transforming communities, Dangote transformational projects, transforming Africa.
He made history this year in Japan as the first black man to captain his team to victory at the 2019 Rugby World Cup. South Africa Springboks captain Siya Kolisi. This month on Talk Asia, we look back at his path to triumph in Yokohama.
I just think it was obviously me not give it up and train.
Talk Asia, Wednesday on CNN. Connect the world with Becky Anderson.
Getting perspective on this region, from this region, bringing you the world from our Middle Eastern hub.
Connect the world with Becky Anderson, tonight on CNN.
Business is all about making connections. But some connections are easier to make than others. With a CNN partner hotel, the world is always at your fingertips. CNN partner hotels, connected to your world.
The best about taking pictures of Budapest is that you have so many options, you have such different places to visit. We have amazing buildings, amazing architecture here. Yay!
I'm Anna Stewart in the City of London, and this is CNN. Welcome back. I'm Isa Suarez. Let's get a check of your headlines this hour. There are fears of more bloodshed in Hong Kong, where police have been in a violent standoff with anti-government protesters on a university campus. Dozens of protesters made a dramatic escape on Monday, but others are still inside. There were multiple arrests using harsh tactics right around the campus. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced a major reversal of long-standing U.S. policy on Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. This move rejects a State Department legal opinion dating back to 1978 that deemed settlements inconsistent with international law. United Nations says that at least 10 people have been killed and another 35 injured in an airstrike on a biscuit factory just outside the Libyan capital Tripoli. The majority of the dead and wounded are migrants. Forces loyal to the Eastern-backed commander Khalifa Haftar have been firing on the city in recent months, but say they have no information on the attack. We are less than a day away now from the second round of public hearings in the U.S. impeachment inquiry, and this week could provide the biggest bombshells yet. We have 9 witnesses scheduled to testify in the House hearings. Some of the key players include James Williams, you see there, who's an aide to Vice President Mike Pence, Kurt Volker to her right, the former US Special Envoy to Ukraine, Gordon Sondland, Ambassador to the EU, and a newly added witness, David Holmes, who is a counselor for British Affairs at US Embassy in Ukraine. Well, CNN is closely monitoring how voters in Wisconsin are reacting to those impeachment hearings they had thus far. Wisconsin is a key swing state in the 2020 presidential race, and voters there could have a big impact on who wins the election. CNN's Miguel Marquez has more.
Third-generation farmer Greg Lohr.
Every cow has a place to lay down.
On the fence.
In 2020, what are you going to do? So undecided.
Dairy cows and harvesting an already laid crop, a bigger worry than impeachment.
I think they should just forget about that and just worry about the issues at hand and try to help people. I mean, there's going to be a new election in another year, I guess.
On impeachment, Sauk County, Wisconsin, northwest of Madison, divided as ever. Farmland and picture postcard towns where the Ringling Brothers got their start. In 2016, candidate Trump won this rural county by 109 votes. Doris Lohr is an independent who supported Hillary Clinton. She dislikes the president, but isn't sure there's enough to remove him from office.
You know, we need to be unified. We need to be. We're not making progress in America. We're going downhill.
The county's divisions obvious. At a regular Democratic protest of the president, they get support, as much as thumbs down among other less polite gestures. Mike and Kerry Walker, co-owners of the Touchdown Tavern, both describe themselves as moderate conservatives. Both voted third party in 2016. She's opposed to abortion rights. but is considered a Democrat.
Can either of you see yourselves voting for a Democrat in 2020? And which one, if so? Boy, that was a pained expression.
It is pain. I will tell you, I love Andrew Yang.
Obviously, he's very smart.
Oh, and he's funny.
On impeachment, they haven't decided whether the president crossed the line.
I don't think it's a witch hunt. I don't think it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. I don't, I think we need to go through this.
Veteran, business owner, and independent voter Greg Snell says he doesn't like Trump, but impeachment?
Well, I believe it's a pretty drastic step. Whether I like the man or not is immaterial. You know, impeachment is, it's pretty drastic.
Dan Shea lives paycheck to paycheck. He voted for Trump. Now, so disillusioned, he switched parties. Where is Sauk County right now?
A toss-up. He's going to have to come here, get his butt off, try to win this state back.
So both parties are going to contest Sauk County and Wisconsin heavily. Democrats are holding their convention in the state. Republicans say it's trending more conservative and they think they can win. At the end of the day, the way the Electoral College is shaping up, those 10 electoral votes here, they could decide who sits in the Oval Office. Miguel Marquez, CNN, Barrett, Wisconsin.
Have some good news and some bad news for the Democratic presidential candidates in the 2020 presidential race. Former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden leading in the key primary state of South Carolina, and that is according to a new Quinnipiac University poll. Biden is ahead with 33%, followed by Senator Elizabeth Warren there with 13%, and Bernie Sanders with 11%, and South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg there with 6%. But in Iowa, look at this, it's a completely different story. According to a new poll, there is Pete Buttigieg, seeing it right, in the top spot with 25%, well past former Vice President Joe Biden, 15%, and Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, 16% and 15% for Sanders. CNN Harry Enton joins me now from New York to make sense of all these numbers. And Harry, it's quite a colossal jump for Mayor Pete. What's behind the success for him in Iowa, at least?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the polls right now in Iowa, what you see is that Pete Buttigieg was only at 9% back in September, and now he's jumped all the way up to 25%, while Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren are going in the other direction. Biden in particular dropping 23, 2015. Look, here's the deal. What you have essentially seen is that Pete Buttigieg has made a pivot in his campaign over the last few months. He decided that instead of trying to appeal to the very liberal voters in the electorate, he was going to appeal towards the center. You see him hitting Elizabeth Warren on Medicare for All, for example. And what we see in the polls right now is that pivot seems to be working, because previously Pete Buttigieg was doing his best among very liberal voters, but if you look at the latest polls from Iowa right now, what you see is in fact he's doing his best among the moderate to conservative voters, and indeed he's actually doing his worst among the very liberal voters. So that pivot is working very well for him.
So just explain to me something. If we can bring up the Iowa, the breakdown in terms of how Buttigieg compares. I'm just going to speak with my producer here. I mean, he clearly has. How much has he invested time and money in Iowa?
He's invested a lot of time, and he is beginning to invest money, and he's the type of candidate who truthfully fits the state fairly well. I mean, he's from right next door in Indiana. That's all in the Midwest, and historically speaking, candidates in the Midwest tend to do better in Iowa, just like candidates in New England, which is obviously in the northeast part of the United States, tend to do best in New Hampshire, which is in the northeast part of the state, so part of the country. So to me, this is the right state for Buttigieg, and you see that in the numbers right now. He is moving up. His very favorable ratings are also climbing considerably. He simply put very well liked there.
Meanwhile, Joe Biden, who to many, Harry, was seen as who remains to many a strong frontrunner, he slipped in Iowa. I think it was 10 points behind Buttigieg. What's behind the drop here? What are people switching off?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the polls, yeah, that's exactly right. Biden is going backwards. And it's not just that he's going backwards since September, he's going backwards since June, and he's going backwards all the way, if you go all the way back since December 2018, his support has dropped by more than half. And the reason is, sometimes, it's always just another candidate who's getting that support, it's not necessarily that Biden's done something wrong. But in this case, the very favorable rating, you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the different candidates. That very favorable rating for him has also been sliced by about half since December of last year. So simply put, the more Iowans get to know Biden, the less they seem to like him, and that's not a good sign for him.
Right, this was Iowa. We're looking at Iowa, but it's quite a different picture, Harry, when we look at the Quinnipiac poll in South Carolina that has him as a front runner? How can it be, explain to international viewers, how can it be so different?
Right, so essentially Iowa goes first. It's the first in the nation caucuses. And then you go to New Hampshire, then you go to Nevada, and then you go to South Carolina. But the key difference, the reason why the Democrats have put these 4 states together to be the first 4 is they're demographically very different. Iowa's in the middle of the country and is mostly white, versus South Carolina, a majority of that electorate will be African American most likely. And where is Joe Biden's main base of support? It is with African Americans. He's getting over 40% of the vote with them. There are none of those voters in Iowa. There are a ton of them in South Carolina. And Pete Buttigieg's problem, why he's all the way back at 6%. Look at that. Among black voters in South Carolina, Pete Buttigieg is getting 0, nada, no black support. And to me, it's very difficult to conceive of Buttigieg winning the nomination, even if he wins in Iowa, if he does not move up his standing with black voters.
Okay, that 0 we're looking at there, why? Why hasn't he been able to break through? Why no support from Democratic black voters? Why can't he make inroads at all here?
I think there are 2 reasons why. Number one, he simply put isn't well known among them. In that Quinnipiac University poll, I believe it was about 60% of African American voters couldn't even form an opinion of him. But that's not the only reason why. It's also the fact that he has no real connections with the African American community. He had real difficulties with the African American community in South Bend, Indiana, where he's currently mayor. And to be honest with you, his performance on the campaign trail when he's trying to reach out to the black community has not been very impressive, versus someone like Biden, who was the VP to the first African American president and has long-standing ties in South Carolina. Black voters, just like any other voters in this country, want to know who you are and want to know they can trust you. They trust Biden. They don't trust Buttigieg.
Very quickly, Harry, is there a sense, you've been looking at polls, this is your level of expertise, is there a sense that people are starting to make up their mind or have made up their mind and it's still all to play for?
Look, at least 60% of the voters say they have not made up their mind. If you were to look at the polls at this point in past cycles and project it out, someone in Buttigieg's position
여기까지 하겠습니다.